Hello and welcome to part 3 of Quantitative Research Design. And in this final part we look at 3 types of design: descriptions, experiments and then quasi-experiments. As an aid to doing this, there's a shorthand or a way of diagramming different design types that's used by some writers. Again, it's not very consistent, but I think it's helpful to get an idea of how different features of research design fit together. And in this shorthand, NRXO, O stands for any kind of observational measurement. So it could be you physically measuring how much crop has been produced, or it could be you're asking people how long they spend collecting firewood in terms of a question and response. So you could be asking people something, could be directly measuring something, could be observing something literally and noting down a number. That's an O. X is an intervention in a situation. So a child be given an inoculation, a policy change like village tax reduced, could be something like an intervention of nature, like a storm or a hurricane or an earthquake. An intervention, something happens to disturb the normal flow of events. And then there's allocation, R and N. This means when you're putting the objects of study into different groups. R is when it's random allocation, and N is when it's non-random allocation, usually because someone or some institution is choosing or the people themselves are choosing which groups go into. And when you lay out these NRXO diagrams, going along is time and going up and down is different groups. But I'll show you what I mean in the next slide, actually in a few slides' time. So example 1, a glamorous example of schools' toilets. And these are often thought quite seriously to be a barrier to the education of girls for clear reasons, because they haven't got privacy, they can't deal with menstrual cycle and privacy, and parents are very reluctant to send their children to school if the girls have not got anywhere that's a private space. So they can be a barrier to girls' education. So 2 different ways you can assess this claim. Well, one of them is get some evidence from schools in a poor rural region, and the first design will be this, OXO. So time is going along this way. So this is the first thing you do. First, it's a measurement. Okay, what percentage of girls are going to the school? So it could be that in a typical classroom, rural East Africa, 40 girls per class. Sorry, 20 girls per class and 20 boys. What percentage of those girls are actually there? Then, next thing is the intervention. Put in some new toilets, that's the X. And then sometime afterwards, you measure attendance again, O, to see what's happened. Fine, that's an OXO design, pretty simple. Alternative is this, and here you see we've got these 2 groups. So one group's having this, another group's having this, and this is just a gap of time. So that's the second design. When, in this case, officials have divided the schools into 2 groups, and because it's officials deciding, hey, this school goes in this group, this school goes in this group, it's not random. Humans are deciding which groups go in, which school goes in which group. So divide them into 2 groups. Then X means they get the improved toilets as usual. This gap means that during that time they have nothing. So this group is called the control group. And then you measure attendance in both groups afterwards. So you should really stop the video here and have a cup of tea and so on. And while you're doing that, think about what are the pros and cons of those 2 designs. Okay, so they're 2 simple designs. One design is pure before and after. And the advantage of that one is that it does measure the change, because you've got a measurement before and a measurement afterwards. However, the downside of that is that change that you observe, what would have happened without the intervention? So if you found that in the second observation there are more girls going to school than in the first observation, maybe that would have happened anyway. Maybe the season had changed, people weren't needed so much at home for crops, there had been a government campaign, or the fees had been cut. Could be something else happened that would have pushed up girls' attendance anyway. So not necessarily to do with putting in the new toilets. So it's got its pros, it's got its cons. The with or without one is the other one, when you have the 2 groups. But the comparison can help us to assess the intervention, because you can see that perhaps there would have been a higher attendance anyway, problem is that you haven't measured the change, and you don't know how the groups would have been different if you hadn't made the intervention. So before you made the intervention, you didn't know whether the groups were similar groups or different groups. Perhaps the groups that you chose to put the toilets into, they were just in more wealthy areas. Maybe that makes sense, that the officials might have thought, hey, let us put the toilets into these areas here with a more kind of wealthy parents that maybe support us, and those girls are more likely to go to school. So there could be some confounding factors that interfere with your interpretation. So both these designs suffer from the problem of the counterfactual, which is the problem of what would have happened to those girls in that school if they hadn't had the toilets. Okay, so that's an example of how you can categorize different types of design in two basic sorts. So now we can look at these three sorts. The most basic one we can say is non-experimental research design, and often just called descriptive research design, even though unfortunately terminology is not consistent because it's a social science, and doesn't make any basis for any claims about what causes what. So you can't really evaluate the intervention, and it doesn't make any basis for generalization. So you're not getting internal or external validity about this with this. And it uses the descriptive techniques you'll be familiar with from school and from other studies from last year if you did the course. So just simple figures, averages, percentages, tables, charts. But you can do a lot with that. And it's, even if you're worried that you need generalization, we need these causality, before you go on and do a whole bunch of fancy techniques, descriptive is a great place to start. So don't knock it. And it's really well suited to case studies. When it's used on its own, it's often in qualitative studies. So examples like this thing by Zoltan Tip, a really nice piece of mainly anthropological writing, and just it's an in-depth study of a village, but just to show you, okay, I'm going to spend 6 months or whatever it was in this village, but just to show you that this village is relevant to other areas, let's just get some figures about percentage of people with these simple things, compare it to the average for the whole of rural Malawi. And you can see, okay, it's kind of representative. So if you get in depth into the things that I'm talking about, it's only a few villages in one village, but these quantitative figures show you that maybe it does apply elsewhere as well. So you can enhance your qualitative studies with a bit of description. Here's a particularly eye-catching bit of research from Tanzania when we're looking at population pyramids. And it doesn't print out very well on this, unfortunately, but if you're familiar with population pyramids, there's the traditional kind of least developed country, poor rural areas, very broad-based, with many people in the younger age groups, and goes quite sharply off towards the older age groups. And then gradually, with increasing wealth and medical care and so on, then it tends to shrink in and becomes more bulgy at the centre, and eventually gets to the kind of the Japanese kind of case where it's more bulgy at the top than it is at the bottom. But even within countries, you find that in the urban areas it's much more towards that, and in the rural areas it's much more spread out. So in this area here, I was looking at one particular very rural area, very remote, but because of a certain amount of economic dynamism, it was starting to develop characteristics of a more sort of growth pole urban area. So I was trying to show that the population shape was kind of midway between the typical rural one and the typical urban one, by looking at how the population pyramid was changing, just by simple percentages and this population pyramid diagram. So again, nothing very fancy. Another bit of anthropological research looking at men's and women's involvement in different crops, and just simple categorizing, looking at different kinds of crop and putting them into categories like, okay, do you sell more than you eat, or do you sell the same amount as you eat, or do you eat more than you sell? And for all the categories, men are selling more than is eaten by their family, whereas for the women, either it's the same or they eat more than they sell for most of the crops. So maize is the only thing they systematically grew as a cash crop. The rest of them, they were primarily doing it as a home food crop. Okay, so how would you put it into NRXO film? Well, it's really simple. It's just this, XO. So something happens, and then you measure and see what's the effect of that. So maybe taxes on taxes on exports have been cut, the exchange rate is cut. Is that encouraging people to grow more cash crops? You just go and talk to people that are growing cash crops, or simply if there's no particular intervention. So, example, this could be the famine, flood, war. Is taken to describe the effect. So, if you're measuring the impact of livelihoods after there's been an earthquake, you're not going to show, okay, the earthquake is the reason why these people are surviving in rubble. It's obvious. You're interested in describing that terrible situation accurately, rather than showing it's because of the earthquake. So it has got a definite place. Other examples are that car article is really worth looking at. And just at the end of the 90s, early 2000s, Dev was very well known in development circles for this development of the livelihoods approach. It's really kind of revolutionised the multi-dimensional measurement of livelihoods, and very descriptive, not fancy statistics, or quite complicated, but not inferential, just descriptive, observational stuff, but rich detail, but not a basis for generalisation or causality. That had to come later. So that's non-experimental work. Next, we'll move on to experimental and quasi-experimental designs, but I'll save that for the next video. So for now, thanks for watching.